Why do Canadians become Basques when they go to war? Canada, a land of maple syrup, hockey, and friendliness. A nation that has become a symbol of peaceful coexistence, tolerance and friendliness. If you ask anyone on the planet to describe Canadians in one word, they will most likely say, cute or polite. But there is one side of the Canadian identity that they prefer not to talk about. The side that doesn't fit into the image of smiling lumberjacks and friendly neighbors. When Canadians go to war, something changes in them. Radically, it's irreversible, it's scary. During the First World War, German soldiers feared the Canadians more than any other Allied troops. Not the British, not the French, not Americans. It is the Canadians. They were called stormtroopers, wild colonists, and the Devil's Brigade. Behind their backs, stories were whispered about homemade clubs with spikes, night raids from which no one returned, and that the Canadians did not take prisoners. Basically, what turns one of the world's most peaceful nations into a ruthless war machine? The trenches of the First World War. When World War I began in 1914, Canada was still a relatively young nation, a dominion of the British Empire. The Canadian Expeditionary Force was formed from volunteer farmers, loggers, hunters, and people accustomed to harsh conditions and hard work. But none of them was ready for the hell that awaited them in the trenches of the Western Front. The first months of the war were a harsh lesson. Canadian units fell into the meat grinder of trench warfare, where thousands of people died within a few meters of the territory. Artillery attacks, gas attacks, dirt, rats, diseases and the constant fear of death, all this broke people. But the Canadians didn't break down. They've adapted, and this adaptation has taken on the darkest forms. By 1915-1916, Canadian units began to develop their own tactics of combat. They abandoned the traditional methods taught to them by British instructors. Instead, they returned to their roots, the experience of wilderness survival, hunting, and guerrilla warfare. The Canadians began conducting night raids into the German trenches, not to take over the territory, not for a strategic advantage, and in order to destroy the enemy. These raids were ruthless and effective. Canadian soldiers made homemade weapons, batons with nails driven in, trench knives, brass knuckles, homemade bombs. They moved silently, using the skills of disguise and stealthy movement. The German guards disappeared into the night before they could raise the alarm. By morning, only the bodies remained. The Germans began to be afraid of the dark. They knew that the Canadians might come at nightfall, and if they come, no one will survive. A makeshift arsenal of death. Canadian soldiers quickly realized that standard weapons were not always effective for close combat in the trenches. The rifles were too long and unwieldy. Bayonets were good, but they required strength and time. So the Canadians started improvising. The most famous weapon of the Canadian stormtroopers were clubs with spikes. They were made from improvised materials, wooden handles from shovels or axes, into which nails, screws, and pieces of barbed wire were driven. Some models were so sophisticated that they resembled medieval Morgensterns. One blow from such a club was enough to kill or incapacitate an opponent. Noiselessly, effectively, terrifying, French knives are another favorite weapon of Canadians. They weren't elegant blades, but crude, functional killing tools. Wide, short blades designed for one thing, to pierce the opponent's body with minimal effort. Some soldiers sharpened ordinary sapper shovels to razor sharpness and used them as axes. Brass knuckles, often homemade, turned every blow into a deadly weapon. Soldiers wore them constantly, ready for a sudden fight in narrow trenches where there was no room for maneuver. But the Canadians' most feared weapons were homemade bombs. Industrial grenades often failed or exploded prematurely. Canadians have learned how to make their own, cans filled with explosives, nails, metal fragments. Primitive, but deadly, they hurled these devices into German dugouts and trenches, turning enclosed spaces into death chambers. The effectiveness of this makeshift arsenal was such that by the end of the war, Canadian units were considered one of the most effective in breaking through enemy positions. 55 raids in 4 months. By the end of 1916, the reputation of Canadians among the German troops was appalling. But they gained real fame, or, more correctly, notoriety, in the run-up to the Battle of Vimy Ridge. 4 months before the offensive, scheduled for April 1917, the Canadian command organized a series of raids on German positions. The goal was simple: to demoralize the enemy, gather intelligence, and undermine the enemy's morale. During this period, the Canadians conducted 55 raids. 55 night raids, each of which turned into a massacre. The worst was the raid in March 1917. Canadian stormtroopers penetrated deep into the German trenches under the cover of darkness. They moved in groups of 10 to 15 people, quickly and silently. When they reached the dugouts, they threw grenades at them and then broke in with batons and knives. Those who tried to give up often did not get the opportunity. German soldiers who survived these raids spoke of Canadian devils who appeared out of nowhere and disappeared, leaving behind only bodies. The psychological effect was devastating. The German units stationed opposite the Canadian positions suffered from nervous breakdowns, refusal to obey orders, and mass desertion. By April 1917, when the Battle of Vimy Ridge began, the German forces were already demoralized. The Canadians stormed a height that the French and British had been unable to take for 2 years, and captured it in 3 days. Their losses were significant, but their success was impressive. The Canadian Corps advanced a kilometer into the enemy's rear, breaking through the defenses that were considered impregnable. Take no prisoners. One of the darkest aspects of Canada's military reputation was their policy towards prisoners of war. More precisely, the absence of one. There is documentary evidence that Canadian commanders openly encouraged the killing of German prisoners. The official reason was pragmatic: lack of food and resources. Feeding the prisoners meant taking food away from their own soldiers. The guards of the prisoners distracted the combat-ready soldiers from the front. The logistics were difficult, and the military situation was critical. But there was another reason. More human: revenge. The Canadian soldiers did not forget about the rumors and reports of German atrocities. Stories about executed prisoners, about the wounded who were killed on the battlefield, about the gas attacks at Ypres in 1915, when the Canadian units suffered terrible losses. Each death of a comrade accumulated rage. Each attack increased his thirst for revenge. Fighting excitement also played a role. The adrenaline of hand-to-hand combat, survival in a trench meat grinder, the constant proximity of death, all this changed the psyche. The soldiers became killing machines, acting on instincts where there is no place for compassion. There were cases when Canadians violated even the unspoken rules of trench warfare. There was a principle of live and let live, an unspoken truce between the warring parties during quiet periods. Soldiers from both sides could leave the trenches without shooting at each other, exchange greetings, even cigarettes. One of the most famous examples: a Canadian sergeant saw 2 German soldiers who waved at him in greeting. He raised his rifle and shot them both. When asked why he did it, he replied, "We're not here to be friends. We are here to win." This ruthlessness has brought the Canadians a tactical advantage, but it has also earned them a reputation that has dogged them for decades. Historians are still arguing about the reasons for the extreme brutality of the Canadian soldiers. One of the most popular theories is related to the crucified Canadian rumor. In April 1915, after the Battle of Ypres, a story spread among Canadian troops that German soldiers had crucified a Canadian soldier on a barn door or on a tree, pinning him to a board with bayonets. This story quickly grew into details. Allegedly, the soldier was still alive when he was found, and he died in agony in front of his comrades. No conclusive evidence of this incident has ever been found. But it didn't matter. The soldiers believed in this story. It was passed from mouth to mouth, becoming part of the collective consciousness of the Canadian Corps. The crucified Canadian became a symbol of German brutality and an excuse for revenge. The traumatic experience at Ypres was in itself a sufficient reason for bitterness. In April 1915, the Germans used chlorine gas in large quantities for the first time. The Canadian units took the brunt of the attack. Without gas masks, gasping, blinded, the soldiers died in agony. Those who survived will forever remember the green cloud of death creeping across the field. After Ypres, Canadians were often sent to the most dangerous sectors of the front. The British command considered them colonial troops, less valuable than British units and more expendable. The Canadians understood this. They knew they were being used as cannon fodder, and this gave rise not only to hatred of the enemy, but also to deep distrust of the Allies. By the end of World War I, Canada had emerged from the shadow of the British Empire. The Canadian Expeditionary Force has earned a reputation as one of the most effective and disciplined armies on the Western Front. The Battle of Vimy Ridge became a national myth, the moment when Canada ceased to be just a colony and became a nation. But there was a dark truth behind that glory. Canadians have earned their reputation not only for bravery and tactical skill, but also for ruthlessness. They were effective because they were willing to do things that others would not do. They won because they had no mercy. This reputation was preserved during the Second World War. When war broke out again in 1939, Canadian troops were once again among the first to join the battle. Once again, they proved themselves to be elite fighters. World War II, D-Day and the Bloody Battle of Normandy. June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allied landings in Normandy. The Canadians were assigned Juno Beach, one of the 5 landing sites. It was one of the most fortified sections of the Atlantic War. The Germans expected an invasion and prepared accordingly: concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, minefields, barbed wire, anti-tank barriers. Canadian units of the 3rd Infantry Division and the 2nd Armored Brigade stormed the beach under heavy fire. The losses were heavy: 340 killed and 574 wounded on the first day alone. But by the end of the day, the Canadians had not only captured the beach, but had also advanced further than all Allied troops into the territory, by almost 10 kilometers. But the real hell started after the landing. The battle for the cities of Caen and Bayeux lasted for weeks. Street battles, snipers, ambushes, every house had to be taken with a fight. The Germans put up fierce resistance, using Tiger and Panther tanks, elite SS units and fanatical Wehrmacht soldiers who were ready to fight to the last. The Canadians responded with the same ruthlessness as in the First World War. They stormed fortified positions, knocked the Germans out of every building, without giving them a moment's respite. By August 1944, Caen had been taken, but the city lay in ruins, and the losses on both sides were enormous. Canadian forces continued their offensive, liberating France and Belgium. Their effectiveness was such that the German command specifically gave orders to avoid collisions with Canadian units if possible. Again, as in the First World War, Canadians have become a symbol of unrelenting power. The Devil's Brigade, American Canadian Special Forces. But the most legendary unit with the participation of Canadians was the Devil's Brigade, the 1st American Canadian Special Forces Brigade. It was a unique experiment, a mixed unit of American and Canadian volunteers created to perform the most dangerous operations. The recruits were selected according to the strictest criteria. Most were hunters, loggers, and trackers, people who grew up in the wild of North America. They were able to survive in extreme conditions, move silently, and shoot with the highest accuracy. They were trained in the mountains of Montana. Rock climbing, mountain climbing, night marches, hand-to-hand combat, subversion. The training was so brutal that a third of the recruits couldn't stand it. Those who stayed became elite fighters, ready for any conditions. Their first real test came in December 1943 in Italy. The Germans held the strategic height of Monte la Defense. The Allies tried to storm the mountains several times, but each attempt ended in failure. The mountain was impregnable: steep cliffs, mine trails, fortified positions on the top. The Devil's Brigade was sent to a place where entire divisions had failed. At night, in total darkness, they started climbing. Without light, in silence, using only ropes and hooks. German intelligence did not expect an attack from this direction. It was considered impossible. When the Canadian-American commandos reached the top at dawn, they caught the Germans off guard. The battle was fierce. The fighters of the Devil's Brigade fought with fanatical tenacity. They used knives, grenades, and went into hand-to-hand combat. The Germans tried to counterattack, but the Canadians and Americans held their positions. By the end of the day, Monte la Defensa was in Allied hands. The squad, which was 10 times smaller than the combined Allied forces that had failed earlier, did what seemed impossible. The Germans started calling them Black Devils because of the camouflage they smeared on their faces and feared them more than any other unit. Canadians have proven one simple truth: the calmest people can be the most dangerous in war. And they proved it, at the cost of blood, cruelty, and a reputation that haunts them to this day. Friends, subscribe to the channel, put likes and write your comments until new meetings.